were the Eleusinian mysteries the ones that where stories would come out about there being almost like Burning Man? You have the arts, you have some sports, some athletics, you have music, you have, you know, you hear stories of orgies. Was that it?
No, I don't think so.
No,
I think those were other mystery cults. I think
I guess those were Dionysian. So maybe
yeah.
I'm getting them mixed up. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, and also we have to take note that we're talking about a practice that extended for 2,000 years at least, more or less. Again, we don't really know the origin. So think about that, 2,000 years. And it's the same with when you look at the story of Soma in India. This is something that took place over a long period of time. There are a lot of different things going on. And so I think that scholars have this, sometimes make this mistake of what Whitehead, one of my favorite phrases, would call the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And that this is a flowing event that went on for a long period of time. It wasn't always the same.
Right.
You know, so, you know, the Eleusinian mysteries may have incorporated more Dionysian aspects over time. There may have been more than one Soma. They want, you know, scholars argue, oh, I think Soma was the Amanita. No, it was the psilocybin. No, it was the cannabis. And you know, my feeling is that it was probably all of those things at different times. You know, if some archaeologist looks back at the 1960s and realizes, oh my God, there was of consciousness in the mid 20th century, and they had a sacrament that they used. Well, it wasn't one sacrament. There was lots of different sacraments used in a lot of different ways. And so I think that's an important point to keep in mind.
I appreciate that. And there was one other thing, and I see you have a question there, Gordo. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, though, when you were saying that many of the people who came from the Eleusinian mysteries saying that the single most profound moment of their life came from an experience at that specific initiation festival or whatever term you can put on that. That's exactly what Roland Griffiths talks about when he would administer psilocybin for people who haven't had the experience before, whether it was somebody terminal with cancer or somebody battling intractable depression. They would use that same phrase. It was the single most mystical or important experience of their life. So I think there's at least something, you know, as these things change over time, 2,000 years, you're right. I mean, we're talking the history of the United States is a fraction of that, really. So that's a long time, and there is a lot of fluidity there, but there's got to also be some continuity. And I think there's something with that phrase right there, the single most important and influential moment of somebody's life often comes from something that, you know, whether brought on by ingesting a psychedelic or having a moment where there's some kind of flood of it endogenously within you, there's something we can today potentially connect with that would put us in a very similar kind of themed experience that these old patriarchs experienced and matriarchs would have experienced back then. So that's another thing that I've often felt, and I've really appreciated your work because of looking at this, not just in a sense of like, you know, flat academia, but the mystery and the mystery schools. And there's something specific about the mystery schools. Whereas if you get real serious with what is the mystery, it's the unexplainable, it's the unknowable. And well, go ahead. Well,
not only is it unexplainable or unknowable, it's forbidden to be spoken about. See, this when we talk about comparing, say, Eleusis with Burning Man, for example, or the psychedelic renaissance, what's happening at Johns Hopkins, and my work was a part of helping that get started, and I love Roland. One of the things about Eleusis that's interesting is not only you were forbidden to say anything about it. In fact, the very etymology of the word mystery means to be silent, to shut your senses. Again, is it because it's political control, or is it a legitimate and important effort to preserve the sacredness? Is it a methodological thing? Like I trained to administer LSD and other psychedelics with Stan Grof. And part of that method, I think they use this at Johns Hopkins too, is that you wear eye shades and you wear headphones, and you are not interacting with the outside world at all. It's a total inner experience. You shut your senses and you go within and you keep your mouth shut. Because if you're talking and looking around, you can dissipate the power of the process. That's one thing. The other thing about Eleusis in particular, and I don't know if this is true about Soma or the other long-running traditions, is that the initiates at Eleusis could go only once in their life. They didn't go back again and again and again. This was a one-time thing. You could go once, you'd have your mind blown, you would taste death, you would see it wasn't the end of life, it would completely change your worldview. You'd be introduced to supernatural beings, you would see the light, and then you had to go out and live your life. You couldn't go, organize a psychedelic conference, or make a living doing this, or become a shaman, or that was a whole nother thing. So that's an important part of it too.
That is very interesting, because we definitely live in a highly commercialized world where we commodify things, such as when you're at Burning Man having a mystical experience, you're also right next to somebody taking a selfie, and this is, it's almost, in some ways, it's the attempt at being similar while also, I guess you could say, violating some very core principles of what those mysteries might have been. Not saying that Burning Man is trying to be those mysteries, but I appreciate what you're saying, because one could often look at Secrecy as only being used for a power grab. And it was John F. Kennedy that said, the very word secrecy is repugnant to a free and independent society. And this is obviously used differently. And he was talking about a very specific form of institutions being open with it. But I like the fact that you mentioned there that it could be methodological as well. There's something that you give away when you speak about your experience that also plants a seed inside other people's that may, put their expectations way up here or way out in left field, and it could influence somebody who the very next year would go in and have that experience.
Yeah, no, it's crazy interesting that you would mention JFK, because maybe in this podcast, or if we're good, we may have to do another one, JFK's relationship to, the whole JFK assassination, but his relationship to psychedelics, his psychedelic experience. But on this point, that the very word secrecy is repugnant, Houston Smith, who's one of the wisest and most wonderful people that I've ever had the pleasure to work with, one of his statements is, mysticism is not democratic. It's hierarchical. And you can see this, again, looking at different spiritual traditions. Like one that I'm very familiar with is the Buddhist Vipassana meditation. And, like in our culture, our kind of 60s inspired psychedelic new age culture, we're so interested in experiences and experience. Oh, I took acid, I had this experience. But if you look at the Buddhist methodology, having mystical experiences are considered corruptions. Like you kind of ignore them. And this is a topic I've devoted some considerable time with. In my first book, maybe we'll talk about that, I conducted a conversation with one of my meditation teachers about this, Jack Kornfield, because one of the things that keeps us bound to our ordinary reality is our attachment and our grasping, and so he gives someone a mystical experience before they've kind of had a handle on this nature of desire and attachment and impermanence, and they have a mystical experience, and suddenly they think they're enlightened,
Right.
And it causes what I'm noticing more and more these days. I call it psychedelic inflation disorder, and it's widespread. Is that people have kind of missed the point, and their insight and their spiritual practice has actually been corrupted by premature glimpses of the transcendental. And, Houston Smith again says this. And, if he were here today, I knew Houston very well, and I had to kind of convince him to write this preface to The Road to Eleusis, because he didn't want to be seen as advocating psychedelic drugs. And so, one of the challenges of our podcast here and the conversations we've had before is that on the one hand, I'm very, very enthusiastic and deeply appreciative of the mystical power and importance of psychedelics, but I'm kind of appalled by the popularizing of them and the profaning of them, and people running to take them before they have their earth base down. They're launching off and they're being distracted and trivializing these profound things. So, Houston made this point very clearly, where he says, he said this back in the early 1970s, or maybe it was even the 60s, where he said, look, the similarity, let's see, what's the exact quote? We know that psychedelic drugs can cause religious experience, can occasion religious experience, but religious experience is not the point. It's the religious life. And he says psychedelic drugs abort a quest as readily, perhaps more readily than they further it. So I want to see that perspective woven in more into the conversation. And if and when, Brian and I pick this thing up, it's like, well, what about that? Houston, there was a reason for these things to be secret. Houston has said this again and again. And let's just not throw this out there, because it ends up countering what we really want to do. So
make sure you all head over to benjosephstewart.com, become a member. You'll have access to the growing library of deeper dives, where I talk about all the stuff that I really can't talk about on YouTube. Make sure you get involved in the Discord chat. That's where a lot of the conversation is happening, talking about new theories, being able to interweave into the greater conversation that is how we awaken infinity. That's our highest potential. And I just want to remind you, you are the most powerful technology ever known to creation. Wield it like an artist with a conscience.